Today, I'm going to show you a one-row buttonhole where you don't need to turn your work in order to work the buttonhole. You're just able to continue working across your row without any fiddly turning. So for this buttonhole, I am using larger buttons, so it is a 3-stitch buttonhole to be able to accommodate the large button, but you'll be able to adjust the buttonhole number of stitches for your button size and yarn weight. I will be demonstrating the buttonhole on my project swatch where I have just picked up stitches along the edge as if I were knitting a button band. Your swatch is a great way to practice any techniques, the stitch pattern, of course, to get gauge, and doing things like practicing a buttonhole. I'm at the place in my work where I want to execute my buttonhole. So I am going to begin by casting on the number of stitches I need to accommodate my button. I know, since I've done this button a couple times before, that I need 3 stitches to accommodate my button. So I'm going to cast on 3 stitches using the backward loop method. If you need more or fewer stitches, you can cast on the number of stitches that you need. I do recommend, if you only have 1 stitch, to use a yarn over instead of a backwards loop cast on. These stitches create the top edge of the buttonhole. Now we're ready to bind off the bottom edge of the buttonhole. Since we have our working yarn here, if we were to join it and do a traditional bind off, our buttonhole would not work as we need it to. So we are going to bind off stitches without actually using the working yarn. So we can just let that yarn go for now, and we'll just slip stitches purlwise. Slip the first 2 stitches and then slip this second stitch over the first stitch on the needle to bind it off. Then we do that again, slipping the next stitch and then slipping the second stitch over that first stitch on the needle to bind it off. Then we're going to do that a 3rd time to bind off our last stitch. Now we have our 3 stitches bound off for our buttonhole, and we can place this last stitch that we bound off back onto the left needle here, and we can continue now working across the row to join our top edge of the buttonhole back with our work. Just continue working in pattern. On the return row, you'll just be able to work across those stitches that you cast on again in pattern and have your buttonhole all ready to go in your work. I'm now at the return row, ready to work over the cast on stitches that I made on the previous row. And you'll just work over the stitches as you normally would. They can be a little bit fiddly because they are kind of a little bit loosey-goosey when you first cast them on. So where I am right now in my button band pattern, I am purling the first stitch and then knitting the next 2 stitches. Once you get over those cast on stitches, it becomes very, very easy to continue to work your pattern. And you have that lovely buttonhole, this is the wrong side, ready to use. And here is what that buttonhole looks like from the right side. If you want to test out your buttonhole without knitting your entire button band or even your entire swatch, a helpful tip is to turn your work a few stitches after you've worked your buttonhole and just work short rows across the small area where you've worked your buttonhole. Then you'll be able to test out with your button to see if it is the right size. So I have just worked across to this column of knit stitches, and then I can turn my work and continue back across this row here and add on another row. Once I've reached the width of my button band, I can test out my button with my buttonhole. I'm now ready to test my button with my buttonhole. My buttons come on a little cardboard card attached with wire. It's a little bit tricky to get the button onto the buttonhole with the cardboard just because it's not super flexible like the knitted fabric is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the button off of the card, keep that wire in there though, and then use my other stitch pattern swatch and place the wire through the fabric. This is just a quick and easy way to essentially test sew on a buttonhole or a button onto your fabric. So I'm just going to twist those wires. You can also, stitch the buttonhole on with yarn, but now I have a much more realistic representation of what it would be like to have a button on my fabric and slide it through the buttonhole. So let's go ahead and test that. That slides through nicely. It is secure, but it's not too tight, not too loose. So that is a good fit for my button. I can also easily undo it. There's a little bit of resistance, but not too much. So I recommend using, if your buttons come with wires, you can just slide those through the fabric, do a little twist to fake sew on your button and do a quick little test, because then you can decide whether you need more or fewer stitches for your buttonhole to create the best fit. Thanks for watching and learning how to make a one-row buttonhole. This buttonhole is especially nice for medium to larger buttons where you need multiple stitches to work your buttonhole, and is also great for large projects like cardigans where you really don't want to have to turn your work to execute your buttonholes. Thanks again for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe.